Hello everybody, welcome back to another build guide video. Today we're going to do support. I might do jungle later today as well, so keep a lookout for that. To start, we're just going to go with Argus. I'm not going to cover Kwong and Zarus due to the fact that I wouldn't really recommend them to new players, even though they can be played in support. I also haven't really gotten a lot of time to play them in support recently, so it's very hard for me to actually recommend a build for those characters. But to start, we're going to go with Argus. Typically, the way that you would go with Argus is Leaf Song. You almost always want to go Leaf Song. The reason being, you kind of need the cooldown from it as Argus. He benefits greatly from it. It's the one of the only support items that actually gives you cooldown as a starter. So it's very good. You're very quick, especially with your mobility and your ability to chase people down with your 3 or stun, things like that. So that's why you go Leaf Song as opposed to something like Sanctify or something like that. You also don't benefit really from Riftwalkers, and the other tree doesn't really do that much for you either. The only thing that the other tree does is give you some power. If you are against a Fae, then you would get Reclamation specifically, but that's a very specific matchup-oriented thing. Then to go into the actual build, you typically end up going, where is it? Dynamo, first item. You are still like a support, so sorry, you got Dynamo second. I would get Time Warp first. Time Warp specifically for Argus first. The next two characters will be Dekker and Belica. We'll talk about why Argus gets Time Warp first and the other characters get Dynamo. Typically, when you play Argus, you really need the mana so you can use your right click and things like that. So he actually needs Time Warp early, which is why you kind of get it first. Then you go into the Dynamo, which is more of a supporty item, and then Tainted Scepter. When you play support, a general rule of thumb is you play for 3 items. These are the 3 most efficient items that you're going to get on a character like Argus. A ton of cooldown, you're helping your team, you're getting some tainted procs. Probably the best set of items that you can pick up as your first 3 items. But that's a general rule of thumb if you're playing support. In fact, for most of these builds, I'm only going to go up to 4 items. I'm not even going to get to the 5th item, because in 99% of games, you're never going to even be in that situation. 4th item, you kind of want some magic defense. You are still like supposed to be kind of like the guy that walks in first. So typically you end up going into Spellbreaker if you need some magical defense. An alternative option would be to get something like Galaxy Greaves. Either one of these in this slot is kind of fine. If you want a little bit more general defense, Galaxy Greaves is fine. If you want a little bit more damage, you can go Spellbreaker, especially if you think you're kind of snowballing a little bit. Now, for most of these builds, if they don't already have Stonewall in them and you end up getting into a game where you get to the last item, just put a Stonewall in there for the most part. In fact, I'm actually just going to leave it down here in the 5th slot. If you end up getting to this point in the game, generally just pick up a Stonewall for most characters. On Argus, you could maybe get like a Caustica if you're really trying to one-shot somebody and things like that. But for the most part, I would recommend like a Stonewall or something, since you are still just kind of a CC bot at this point in the game. Moving along, you're going to go to Dekker. Dekker kind of has 2 different play styles, one being more backline oriented, one being a little bit more frontline oriented. If you're looking for big combos, you generally go the Riftwalkers. It also gives you a little bit more tank stats. If you're looking to be a little bit more of a backline CC bot heal, then you're going to go the Tranquility. I would generally recommend Riftwalkers as being the one that actually makes characters a lot more effective. So typically I end up going Riftwalkers, but if you're a little bit safer, maybe you want to play a little bit more backliney and just peel, you could definitely go Tranquility, and that's fine. As for the rest of the build, you start with Dynamo, a little bit different than Argus. Yes, you benefit greatly from the mana and things like that, but it's not 100% required like it is on Argus. So you like those tank stats early, you like increasing your team's damage a little bit. Very strong item. Then you go into Tainted Scepter second. The reason you go Tainted second is because you need anti-heal. It also gives you, again, some HP, some more cooldown, and things like that. Third, if you need it, you can go Time Warp if you still want to be a little bit more of an aggressive character. Otherwise, you can slot in a Galaxy Greaves in this 3rd slot. Either one is fine. Typically, I end up going Time Warp because I kind of want to be the guy that's carrying the games. But if you are kind of frontliney and you kind of want to be a little bit more difficult to lock down, then you would go Galaxy Greaves. In the 4th slot, you end up going either Time Warp if you didn't go it in the 3rd slot, Galaxy Greaves if you ended up going Time Warp, or Spellbreaker. Again, this is very similar to Argus. You either go Spellbreaker if you want some more damage, you go Galaxy Greaves if you want to be a little bit more defensive. If you end up getting Galaxy Greaves in the 3rd slot, it's the same concept with Time Warp and Spellbreaker. If you want a little bit more defense, you get Spellbreaker. If you want a little bit more damage, then you get Time Warp. This is typically how Dekker is built, and then you can finish with a stone wall or whatever. You could even get a spellbreaker last if you really want to, something like that. Moving along, the next support that we have is Belica. Belica, kind of similar to Dekker, pretty much the exact same build and the same like reasoning behind everything. The only difference being you always go Tranquility or you go Silentium. You never really go the Tank Crest. You could theoretically go Leaf Song or Sanctify, but I would more or less recommend Tranquility in 99% of situations. If you are confident at Silentium or you're against characters that Silentium really counter, for example, maybe you're against a Narbash and you want to cancel Zolt, a Gideon maybe, a Crunch gets really shut down by this item, you can go Silentium instead of Tranquility. In most games, I would 100% recommend Tranquility, though. And the build is the same order and the same logic basically behind the items as Dekker, so there's not really a ton to go over. Again, you can go Galaxy in the 3rd spot or the 4th slot, and then you can kind of interchange all 3 of these items. The only thing I would say is if you get Spellbreaker, you almost always get it 4th, whereas Time Warp and Galaxy, you can flex into the 3rd slot, and then the other one can flex in the 4th slot with Spellbreaker, depending on what you need. Moving along to Muriel, she's kind of the first support that kind of actually gets like a different build than some of these other supports, just due to the fact that she plays differently. The first 3 are a lot more aggressive and they're kind of more frontliney, like mage caster type supports, whereas Muriel's not really like that. Muriel, I would typically recommend you either go Tranquility or you go, where is it? Sanctify. There we go. Sanctify. Basically, the reason this is good on Muriel is if you Sanctify and then Shield, the Muriel Shield actually goes over the Sanctify, which means your team gets a extended duration of the Tenacity, which can be really strong, depending on what team comp you're against. Specifically against like a Steel maybe, or something that has some heavy CC in the front line. Maybe your team's getting Riktor ulted or Faye ulted or something you can Sanctify. You can go Tranquility again into specific matchups like Faye, but I'm not going to get too much into that since that's very game specific and it might not even be the best option. In most games, I would say Tranquility is probably better. It's a little bit easier to use, so I would typically recommend that for most players. As for builds, you kind of have 2 starting options. One is a little bit more aggressive, one is a little bit more defensive. If you want a little bit more of like a defensive, I'm going to sit behind my ADC type build, you can go Crystal Tier. If you think you are kind of snowballing the lane a little bit or you want to be like kind of more of a lane bully, you can go Marshall. This also helps your team do objectives, which Muriel is already really good at due to her passive applying damage per level or per her passive anyways when you shield people. So between that and Marshall, you can actually really shred objectives, which can be a really big strength. Either one of these items is fine in the first slot. Second item you end up going is Wellspring. Wellspring is just strong. It gives you healing to your team on top of the shields, which is really nice. Good stats, and it's just kind of everything you need. It also increases the amount of shielding that you do when you buy it due to the base stats. As for third item, you tend to get either Tainted Totem or Time Warp. If you need anti-heal, you get Tainted Totem. If you don't need anti-heal, then you get Time Warp. Either one is fine. Time Warp is really strong actually on Muriel. You get a ton of cooldown, and then the passive allowing you to go over the cooldown cap is very strong. And then Tainted Totem, it just applies anti-heal to everybody that you shielded, which can be really good in certain matchups. Maybe you're against a Rampage or something like that. You can also even put Tainted Totem in the first slot if you really need it early. Maybe you're laning against a FaZe or a Narbash or something like that, and then end up getting the Time Warp in the later slot like this, which is also completely acceptable. Typically, I'll end up going Crystal Tier and go into a build like this, which is a little bit more shield oriented, but again, you might need Tainted in most games, depending on what you're against. And then lastly, you kind of finish it up with something that you didn't buy. So if you ended up not buying Tainted, then you end up getting a Tainted here. Alternatively, you could get like a defense item, something like a Stonewall, since you're not really going to get to an item past this most of the time. Again, you could throw a Stonewall in here. You generally move this up just because you're not going to be able to get a 5th item in most games. Typically, the reason Stonewall is good is you ult into the front line or in the back line, and then you're kind of the target as Muriel. This kind of stops you from being targeted. It makes you very tanky. You can tank some shots, you get some HP, and you become a lot more of a nuisance, especially if somebody's right on top of you. It stuns them, you can create space, things like that. So this is typically what I would build on Muriel in most games. Again, Marshall and Tainted, very good optional items, as well as Sanctification. Moving along to Narbash, you will always buy Sanctification. There's no reason not to buy Sanctification. It just is really good, and then it also stacks with this next item that we're going to talk about, which is True Silver Bracelet. True Silver Bracelet, very, very strong item. It basically just allows you to ult, and then you get a shield. When you have the shield, you become CC immune. The reason Sanctification is good is that you can activate your ult, get the immunity from True Silver, and then during your ultimate, activate Sanctification, and then the shield goes over the True Silver shield, meaning that you have a larger duration of CC immunity. This pretty much guarantees that your ult is going to go off and you will stun somebody. This is very good, just an insanely strong item, and I would highly recommend you going True Silver first. A lot of people like to go Crystal Tier. The reason you don't go Crystal Tier first is you become very squishy. I would not recommend building Crystal Tier first, just due to that fact that you will be very squishy. As for the next item you go, you generally end up going into, where is it? Hexbound Bracer, or you end up getting Tainted. Either one is fine. If you need some physical defense and you want some cooldown, you go Hexbound. If you want some anti-heal, you can go Tainted. It also gives you cooldown. Either one is good. It just depends on the game. If you need anti-heal, you get Tainted. If you don't need anti-heal, you get Hexbound. These are kind of your mana regen items. As long as you're playing well, you shouldn't need more than this in terms of mana regen. So these are kind of the typical go-to items. Your next item after that is Dynamo. You have good CC and good setup. Gives you cooldown, some protections, HP, kind of everything you need. And it's also very cheap. That's the other thing with a lot of the support items is they're very cheap. Like this build is very cheap. Fourth item you end up is Stonewall. You will get this pretty much every game. You're a frontline character. You're beefy. You like to take damage. You're healing. Stonewall gets a lot of value from that. So you can actually get in the front line. Ult, if they try to kill you in your ult, maybe you at least get a Stonewall stun, which also synergizes with Dynamo as it does stun them, which does proc the Dynamo passive. So this is a very good item, and it can also get you out of a lot of sticky situations where maybe you're getting gone on and then you can flash out in a lot of spots. So this is my typical Narbash build, and what I would recommend, again, Hexbound and Tainted, flexible, depending on what you need in that game. Going along to Phase, the next character. You will almost always buy Tranquility. There's no reason to really buy anything else. You are a healer. It benefits your healing the most. You're not really benefiting from Sanctification since you're not in the front line, you're only in the back line. Reclamation could be bought in certain matchups, but you also pull people out of things. So like if you're against the Fae, you don't really need Reclamation because you can just pull whoever gets pulled by the Fae ultimate, effectively negating it. So this is basically why you go Tranquility. None of the other support items really suit her too well. Leaf Song can be decent, but it's not the best. You don't really benefit from Silentium or anything like that. If you are against like a Gideon specifically, you could go Silentium or something like a Crunch, very similar to Belica, but in 90% of games, you will end up going Tranquility. As for the build, I generally like to go Wellspring first. This is just increases your healing a little bit more, gives you some power, things like that. It heals your teammates. Very nice. It is a little bit like slow compared to some of the other items, but again, when you're playing support, you're playing for 4 items, like 3 to 4 items. So typically your 3 items that you get first should have the most value compared to any other game, any other items. Then you end up going into Galaxy Greaves, which is just very good. It lets you get a lot more mobility and buy a lot more time with your 2, which is very strong. Being able to float with the beam at max height can be really good. It also helps on roam since you get a little bit of movement speed. Third item, you go Tainted. You can actually swap either one of these. Typically, I go Galaxy Greaves just because it allows you to rotate a lot more. And if you're already ahead or whatever, you can get a lot more value, or you create more space between you and your ADC, which allows you to pull them further than you would normally. So either one of these is fine in the second or the third slot. Typically, this would be what I always end up going in the second and third slot. Fourth, I get Crystal Tier. Pretty straightforward. You just want some more healing. Alternatively, the last item that you could get either in the 4th or the 5th slot is Stonewall. Again, kind of similar to Muriel. You're going to be the target in team fight, so if you get a Stonewall and somebody's on top of you, you can create a lot more space, you buy a lot more time, and you become a lot tankier, especially if you're against an assassin like Feng Mao or Kalari or something like that that's really going to try to one-shot you. It can be very beneficial. But these are typically the last 2 items I go, whether it's 4th or 5th, depends on the game and how it's going, if you even get to that point in the game. Again, most of the time you're playing for the first 3 items. Then we go along to Riktor, probably the best support in the game right now, but he is a little bit hit or miss. You either hit or you don't. There's kind of 2 starters that you can go, Sanctification or Riftwalkers. Generally speaking, Sanctification is better, but if you're looking to have a little bit of fun or you maybe want to try to hit a big combo, you can definitely go Riftwalkers. The reason Sanctification is better than Riftwalkers is because when you Riftwalker, it actually pulls everybody to you, which then means that when you try to ult after to hit a big combo, it's a lot harder to hit all of them due to the fact that they're at the center of the cone. And if the closer they are to you in the cone, the harder it is to hit everybody. So generally speaking, you should go Sanctification. Also makes it a little bit harder for the enemy team to commit to you, since you will get some tenacity as well if you time it right before CC. So either one is fine. I generally recommend Sanctification, but if you are looking to be him and be the playmaker, Riftwalker could definitely do that for you. Moving along to the build. Dynamo is typically your first item. It gives you mana, cooldown, prots, very strong. You have a lot of CC, so you can lock people down very heavily. Your team starts to do more damage to the people that you're locking down. Also, very cheap item. This is typically why you would go Dynamo in most games. As for your second item, you're going to go Tainted Bastion. The reason you go Tainted Bastion is you kind of need some magic defense. At some point, you are a frontline heavy character. This also gives you 5% mitigation even if you don't apply the anti-heal. So if you get hit by an ADC that doesn't have magical damage, for example, you do not actually get nothing from it. You still get 5% mitigation against that type, which is still really nice. Again, another very cheap item. You're kind of a frontline tank, so you're expected to die a little bit, and it does give you some good stats as well. As for your third item, if you need more magical, you end up getting Flux. Alternatively, you can end up getting Tainted Guard. Tainted Guard kind of got nerfed a little bit recently, so it's a little bit more expensive. Either one of these items is fine. If you want a little bit more magical defense, you go Flux. If you want a little bit more physical, you get Tainted. The other thing that you get from these is cooldown. Both of them give good cooldown, which you really need as a Riktor because you're trying to throw hooks as often as possible. Another thing to take into consideration is whether or not you have a lot of magical characters. Maybe you have a Kwang off lane, maybe you have a Gadget on your team, plus like a Shimby or something like that. You might want to go Flux over a Guard just to increase your team's damage as well. Combined with the Dynamo, can be really effective at taking out teams. As for your fourth and fifth item, you could pretty much go Guard or Stonewall. Again, if you have Bastion already, which you should, Guard is still valuable even at this point in the game. You can also go Stonewall here, considering you're playing for 4 items. Either one is fine, and then fifth item, you just finish with whichever one you get if it goes that late. Whether you got Stonewall first, you get Tainted last. If you get Tainted first, you get Stonewall last. Either one of these is fine. You can get either one in either slot. And again, the Flux is there as well. You can also go Tainted here for the mitigation and then get Flux later in the game at 4th slot. But typically, again, most games will not go this far. So you're generally playing for the 3rd item slot. Steel, very similar to Riktor. The only difference being you always go Riftwalkers. You will never go Sanctification. You are always the playmaker. You're always trying to go in. Maybe you dash, Riftwalker, right click, ult somebody. You're always looking to combo and get a fat combo if you can. Riftwalker allows you to do this. You don't really have to worry about missing like you do on Riktor. So you always go Riftwalker and you're always a playmaker. You're a little bit weak in the early game, but that's just kind of the nature of playing a melee character in Pred. Your typical build will be Dynamo first, and then you go into Flux. The reason you do this is you get a lot of cooldown, HP, some prots, very cheap items, very effective on steel. Then your third and fourth item, you are going double Tainted. In most games, you will almost always need Tainted. You can go either one. You don't need both, but you could go both if you want to. Very similar to Riktor. And then fourth item, you end up getting Stonewall most games. You can also get it last and go double Tainted first. Either one is fine. Pretty much the same thing as Riktor. The only difference is that you get the Flux earlier because you benefit a lot from the cooldown and you require it early, as well as helping your team. Since you get such big wombo combos, it's very easy to get a lot of value off of it. But that's going to do it for the support guide. I appreciate everybody watching. Again, I'm not going to cover things like Kwang and Zarus. I just don't have enough time to play on them. Recently as a support, I'm not really sure what you would even build on them if you want to. They are very viable along with other characters like Howitzer and things like that, but I just don't think it's worth covering if I don't have the personal experience myself. Even if I was to ask somebody for their opinion that main support, I just don't think that's as valuable if I can't confirm it myself, and I don't want to give you guys any false information. So that's gonna do it for me. Again, I appreciate everybody watching. I hope a really good rest of their day, and maybe you learned something.